The target pattern for this lecture is, what would you do if? So this pattern is a question. What would you do if? Let's look at what this means. It's a very common pattern. What's the meaning? So look at this example. What would you do if you became a millionaire? So what does this question mean? It means, what would you do or how would you feel if this situation happened? We often use this particular pattern hypothetically. This is for unreal or impossible situations. This is a very common and useful pattern. We can use it in a variety of situations. So in the example we just read, I said, what would you do if you became a millionaire? So someone who's very, very rich, has lots of money. Now this question is hypothetical, and this means we're just imagining. It's just for fun. So when I say, what would you do if you became a millionaire? You just have to imagine. What would you do if you had lots of money? So you might reply with, I would buy a beautiful house. I'd buy a Ferrari. I'd go traveling around the world. So it's just a hypothetical question. It's just an imaginary or unreal situation. Another example might be, what would you do if you visited the moon? So this is just an imaginary situation. So it's a very, very common structure. It doesn't have to be hypothetical, unreal. It can be real. So I might ask my friend, what would you do if you got the job? So in this case, it's a real situation. He has applied for a new job, and I can say, what would you do if you got the job? So we're thinking about the future, but it's a possible situation in the future. Now, let's move on to the example sentences. Here is the first one. I've been offered another job for more money, but I love my current job. What would you do if you were in my position? This person is asking for advice. He's saying, someone offered me a job. It's more money, but I love my current job. What would you do in this situation? Would you go for more money, or would you stay at the job that you love? So we often use this pattern, what would you do if, to talk about my situation. So I'm asking you, what would you do if you were me? What would you do in my situation? This is a good way to ask for advice. Okay, so when you have a problem or a dilemma, you can ask your friend, what would you do if you were me? Okay, here is another example. Peter says, I'm going to start a new business. And Pam says, that's great, but what would you do if you failed? So Pam is worrying for Peter. So Peter is going to start a new business, and Pam says, well, that's good, but what would you do if you failed? So she's imagining the future, and she's saying, if you failed, how would you feel? How would you cope? How would you react? Okay, so she's imagining a negative situation in the future. Here is the third example. What would you do if you could live forever? So this is definitely a hypothetical question because it's pretty much impossible for now. What would you do if you could live forever? So this question is really asking, how would you feel? So even though the verb is do, what would you do? Often we want the person's answer to be, how would you feel? So in this case, what would you do if you could live forever? Is basically saying, how would you feel? You might answer, well, I wouldn't like it because I'd grow very old. I'd have to get many different jobs throughout my life. I'd have to work hard. Or you might say, wow, I would feel great. That would be fantastic. I would love to live forever. So it's not always what you would do exactly, it's how you would feel as well. Now let's look at the structure for this question. We use the pattern, what would you do if, plus a noun, plus a past tense verb. So for example, what would you do if you failed? So the structure of this pattern is very important. We use a past tense verb, not a present tense verb. Even though we're talking about the future, an imaginary future or an imaginary situation, we don't use a future tense. We use a past tense verb. Okay? It's very important to remember that. Now, move on to the exercises, the speaking and the listening exercises. Practice those and make sure you download the MP3s as well. I'll see you in the next lecture.